So I've been playing the Elden Ring DLC quite a bit lately, as I'm sure many of you have been. And if you're anywhere as bad as I am, this experience will supremely test your sanity and stubbornness as you try to take on some of the hardest enemies found in the entire game. First I had my shit pushed in by this Black Jail Knight for a bit, which confused me, as once I walked in I thought, oh, Sword Guy. I've beat Sword Guy before. You'd think for a sec that this is the second coming of Malenia, but no, it's just Miyazaki letting us know not to take the Land of Shadow lightly, and to maybe, level up your vigor a bit. The real second coming of Malenia comes later on in this cock and ball torture of a DLC, in the form of an elegant but intimidating boss we'll find within the depths of Castle Ensis. Rellana, Twin Moon Knight, depending on the path of travel you took in this region of the game, might be the first roadblock you run into. And boy, is it a roadblock. This boss tests your ability to stay patient and not get overwhelmed by a flurry of what feels like never-ending slashes from her dual swords. It's a fight where you as a player need to take a step back and figure out how you're going to approach it, as opposed to understanding that after dodging a few heavy swings from a big boy, you'll have your chance to counterattack. Here, moments where you think you might have an opening are realistically the greatest traps the boss can set, as the startup for her quickest attacks can feel extremely hard to anticipate. But while being a tumultuous task to overcome, there are so many aspects of this boss that I was enamored by while trying to break through her flurry of blades. As soon as you walk through the doorway and misread her name as Renalla for the first time, you immediately understand that there has to be some sort of connection between the two. Backed up by her title being the Twin Moon Knight, I was instantly convinced that this character had deeper lore implications in regard to the Queen of the Full Moon. And in reading into some item descriptions, we'll find this to be true and then some, as this character had some serious influence in the Land of Shadow as a result of the events concerning the Lands Between. Welcome to Figuring Out Fantasy, where we'll be diving into a boss which is far more relevant than just a remembrance fight to test your mettle, and understanding how she involves not only the one who dons a similar name, but the overarching plot of the Greater Will and the shadows of the Erdtree. As we approach Castle Ensis, we start to understand the theme that we'll be running into as evidence of the surrounding environment outside and once we enter. Finding a Spelldrake talisman outside and running into both Lazuli sorcerers as well as Troll Knights, we can expect to run into some familiar Carian sorceries, similar to those we had seen in the core of Liurnia Lakes, Raya Academy. The castle and its purpose as part of the Land of Shadow aren't quite clear, but through the Glintblade Trio's description, we can read that the prototypical form of sword phalanx sorceries, the ones that spawn a bunch of Glintblades to swarm you, saw a subsequent refinement in the realm of Shadow, possibly gleaning towards the fact that the regions within this new Land of Shadow which study and practice Carian sorcery are even more potent than those found in the Lands Between we've grown accustomed to. Traversing Castle Ensis feels like a Carian dungeon through and through, but this time with a solid 10 times more jump scare enemies. And once we make it through and approach this staircase somehow alive, after making the trek through countless waves of some of the most aggravating nonsense I've ever dealt with, we'll find Moonrithel, Carian Knight. That's it. In defeating this surprisingly tough encounter, we can acquire her familiar colossal sword, which is the first mention we can find about the Twin Moon Knight. The sword describes Moonrithil as the Twin Moon Knight's Chamberlain, giving us pause as to just who the one possessing this lofty title may be. The other half to the description of Moonrithil's Knight Sword is also quite interesting, as it describes how she was a friend of the trolls who served the royal family we know quite well. It continues to read how she proudly wielded their weapons as she fought arm in arm with her gargantuan comrades, making it evident as to why the appearance is identical to that of the Troll Knight sword we find early on in the Lands Between. But why are these Carian sorcerers and all those surrounding its royal families found here in the Land of Shadow? Well, much of that will be answered as we approach the final steps of the Legacy Dungeon. Stepping through the doorway into the wide open area floods you with many thoughts all at once, similar to most Elden Ring bosses who look like they're capable of whooping our ass. But as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm willing to bet that you misread her name as Renalla the first time her monstrous health bar dawned the bottom of your screen, giving you an impression that all of the Carian sorceries we've come across while traversing the castle behind us link back to something we already understand. And honestly, I'm here for it. While we can expect some overlap between the Land of Shadow and the Lands Between, considering it's essentially the ground zero for the base game, it feels nice as a player to recognize some sort of continuity without having to dig deeper into the lore implications right away. Experiencing Castle Ensis from start to finish feels like something that could have been in the Lands Between historically, but now we need to try and decipher its purposes within the Land of Shadow, knowing what we do about our time in Liurnia Lakes and Raya Lucaria. Back to Rellana, once we get the dyslexia out of our heads and read her name properly, her similarities to Loretta kick in immediately as she begins to cast a plethora of failing sorceries to overwhelm us. And if we recall, Loretta was designated as a guard to the Carian royal family, evident from the blue glintstone that was once implanted in her war sickle, only to be removed and replaced with unalloyed gold. For a large portion of this fight in front of us, Rellana will utilize her own iteration of these spells, but we'll learn that she was a bit more destined to wield them than Loretta ever was. But even beyond her destiny as a Carian princess, now she holds a surprising power in her possession to boot. After withstanding her first phase for long enough, Rellana will eventually unleash a coupling of both luminous moonlight and blinding fire, throwing many challengers for a spin with this surprising addition to her already powerful arsenal. We see an entirely unexpected side to a boss named the Twin Moon Knight. Why on earth would an individual blessed by the moon ever be associated with the destructive and chaotic nature of fire? The Carian Knights had always been a bit more reserved and elegant, making this seem like a direct clash against the standards of what we've always expected from one associated with the royal family. But once we get through this boss... I said, once we get through this boss fight. What I'm trying to say is that once we get through this boss fight, we can discover a bit more... Oh, come on! This fight sucks. But it sucks so good. Before I keep going on the lore, I wanted to just say how much I love this shit. Now this may sound like a shock to the two of my friends going through it with me while I refused to play like I had hands in this fight, but after completing the DLC, I can't help but feel like this fight shines even brighter after knowing what else there is to experience deeper in the Lands of Shadow. The ambiguity of her attack startups can feel extremely unfair to deal with at first, given that you just have no semblance of a clue as to when to get your counterattacks in. But once you learn the qualities of the strikes she continues to throw out, you end up understanding the fight to a point where it becomes a glorious duel of sharpened steel. Regardless of the manner in which you get to her second phase, once it ensues, it's kinda just like, what the fuck? From Software seems to have put their entire animation budget into making sure that the big move these bosses do at the start of their second phase leave you absolutely hopeless in going in for another attempt, feeling like there's just no way I'm gonna make it around that, like there's just no way! Alright, I just needed to stagger her. Nice. Well, at least I can finally get along with the rest of this video. No joke, I couldn't keep writing this damn script until I finished beating this godforsaken boss, since I needed access to her remembrance, which actually opens our eyes a bit more to what landed Rellana where we end up fighting her, and why we find her wielding a blade covered in Messmer's flame. Now the entirety of Messmer's story is going to be kept for another video, but we'll get some glimpses of it within the telling of Rellana's. To shorten it as much as possible for time's sake, Messmer is a son of Marika's, and the Land of Shadow was where the God Queen originated from. In seeking to become the divine sovereign to oversee the lands between and initiate a new golden order, she left behind her history in the shaman villages where she was born. And discovering that a malevolent snake writhed within Messmer, she took it upon herself to pluck out his eye and replace it with a seal of grace. And in the time following, her fear would lead her to secret him away within the Land of Shadow, where he would be kept with what she deemed to be the original sin. And her hatred for this region at the heart of the lands between would not be confined as long as he reigned over them. Now is where the subject of this video comes back into the story. Having been born as a Carian princess, she would look up to her older sister Renalla as she undertook the responsibilities of her birthright, becoming a Carian knight under her elder sibling's command. In her younger years, she would learn the way of Carian sorcery from a figure we can find farther on in the DLC, Count Ymir. But this was before he abandoned his allegiance to the moon and sought out the influence of the fingers, claiming that his prior devotion was due to it being the closest of the celestial bodies and nothing more. Rellana remained with the royal family in the wake of her instructor leaving, and her, along with her sister Renalla, would eventually go on to meet a pair of twin moons, those of which overlapped each other as though they nestled against one another. These twin moons would come to be Rellana's signature battle spell, representing one of the most magnificent displays of Carian sorcery the Academy had ever seen. Rellana, Loretta, and the rest of the combined 20 Carian knights would go on to be extremely formidable opponents to those who would take on their ranks. But somewhere along the way, what was taking place within the Land of Shadow began to affect Rellana, and her mind was flooded with conflict. While many of the big figures we encounter throughout the lands between are gods, demigods, or ones destined to become a god, those that are a part of the Carian royal family are all very much human, extremely powerful, but still human. I say this because I believe that both of these sisters displayed many layers of emotion within their stories. Renalla is a victim herself of heartbreak and delusion, after having been left empty at the hands of Radagon. And as for Rellana, she saw what Messmer was enduring in the Land of Shadow, and couldn't fathom the hatred that raged on in his heart. She knew though that not even the power of the moon would be able to grant him succor, having been abandoned by his own mother, and instead disavowed her birthright to stand alongside him in pursuit of trying to grant him peace through assisting in his. Rellana would take part in ritual combat, wielding her carry and thrusting shield, and as found further in the description of this weapon, it was a demonstration of fidelity to the Erdtree. She would soon be known as the Sword of Mesmer, and to go along with her single light greatsword donning a brilliant blue glintstone, she would begin to wield a second, more destructive weapon in her offhand. Here, and here alone, were moon and fire ever together.